Hello there, welcome. So today we're going to talk about gear changing. Now gear changing is something that you'll probably be familiar with if you drive a car or ride a push bike. But on a motorcycle it's very slightly different, although the principles are the same. You'll be taught gear changing on element C of your CBT and you'll refine it out on the road. Lower gears, first and second, are there to provide plenty of pulling power, starting power to move the weight, and the higher gears, fourth, fifth, sixth, are there to provide the speed. So the lower gears will not provide a good speed and the higher gears will not provide good pulling power. So when we look at the use of our controls of our gears, it's important that we use them in the same way that we should for all motorcycle controls, and that is smoothly and progressively. So to start off, we will normally use first gear. In exceptional circumstances, we may consider a second, but that would not be the norm. So as you can see, the green light is on the dashboard, the N, which stands for neutral, so we're not in any gear at all. Now, motorcycle gearboxes are laid out differently to car gearboxes. Basically, the gear selector is a lever which always remains in the same position. And for most motorcycles, the gearbox is 1 down and 4 or 5 up. Neutral sits between first and second. And to select that, you require a gentle half a shift up from first, or a gentle half a shift down from second. You have to make each individual gear change separately on a motorcycle. You cannot do what you do with a car and immediately jump from one gear to another. You must always go through the gears in sequence. However, that doesn't mean you have to use that gear, which we'll talk about more later. So to select first gear, we bring the clutch all the way into the handlebar, place our foot on top of the gear selector and press firmly down. We should feel a little clonk and we should get a first indicated if we have a gear position indicator. Now sometimes it won't select and I see people kicking quite vigorously at the gear selector. You shouldn't do that. If it doesn't select, just allow the clutch to come gently out to the bite while pressing on the gear selector. You will then feel that gear go in. Now we know from our earlier training we must always allow the clutch to come out smoothly and progressively. So the first point we do is we come gently out to the bite whilst increasing the revs and gently and smoothly allowing that clutch to come out. What we never ever do with a clutch is what we call dump it. We never just let it fly out. And that is also the case when we are changing up through the gears. So it may be less noticeable, but it could affect your muscle memory if you get into the habit of being quite harsh or aggressive with the clutch. Never be harsh and aggressive with the clutch. So when we want to change the subsequent gears as the engine revs up and we get faster, we get our toes underneath the gear selector in good time, and then we press firmly up to select the gear that we require. What we don't do is flick at it with our toes, and neither do we kick it in a harsh way. So I'm just going to change down gear now. So I bring my toes on top of the gear selector, I press firmly down, and I can linger. I don't flick, I can linger on that selection, and then I release the pressure on the gear selector, which returns it back to its central position, which means it's ready to select another gear. So when going up through the gearbox in anticipation, I place my toes underneath the gear selector so I can feel it. I close the throttle and bring the clutch in simultaneously, and then press up firmly and linger just for a moment. The clutch comes smoothly and gently back out whilst increasing the throttle as much as I need, and I then relax my foot pressure on the gear selector. So being a sequential gearbox, we go up and down the gearbox one by one. So at the moment I'm in fourth. I'm just under 2,000 revs. Now, depending on the size of the engine is going to depend when you need to change your gears. So the larger the engine with more torque, the less you're likely to have to change gears. You can be a little bit lazier if you want to be, although it's never a good thing to be lazy with a motorcycle. But if you ride a little bike, especially a 125 with 14 horsepower, you're going to be up and down that gearbox a lot. So as I approach the roundabout in fourth, I'm going to have a second, third, second. So although I've had to change 2 gears, I didn't have to use third. I could just hold the clutch in and select down to second. So when we make changes in that way, it's referred to as block changing, as opposed to sequential changing. Now I know to turn this corner is a second or a first if I've got to stop. 5, 4, 3, 2, and away we go. Third, limit 40, so I can increase the power on the bike. Fourth, I see a lot of people rush gear changes. They cannot wait to change gear. It's quite frantic almost. Gear changes should be very calm and very relaxed. If you're planning your ride, there should be no reason for you to rush any gear change at all. You purely get your foot in the correct position in good time, and then your hands can close the throttle, pull the clutch in simultaneously. You can make a nice gear shift up or down, and then allow your hands to recontrol the throttle and the clutch together as required. Gear changing does take time to get it into your psyche and get used to it. It's like any learnt skill. It takes time for it to become instinctive, but it needs to become instinctive because it's a really important part of controlling your motorcycle. Now, one thing that learner riders sometimes do, and you must not do this, is they look down to change gear. Don't ever look down to change gear. It's important that you're trained sufficiently off-road first so that you've built your muscle memory and you've got those little feelings, so you know that your foot is in the correct place, that you know what is happening. So if you want to go off-road and watch your foot go up and down on the gear selector while you're stationary, then by all means do that. Don't do it out on the road. If you look down when riding a motorcycle, you're on a very high risk of taking a route on the road that you don't want, going into the verge or crossing the white line in front of oncoming traffic. If you can't change gear without looking down, you shouldn't be on the road.
So a lot of motorcycles do not come with gear position indicators. And one of the questions I get asked a lot by students is, how do I know what gear I'm in? It only matters that you know that you're in first gear, because that's the gear you need to be in to pull away. As regards every other gear, you don't necessarily need to know what number gear you're in. You can always shift up if you want, and if you can't go any further up the gearbox, you know you're in top. When you're coming down the gearbox, if you reach the bottom and you can't go any further, you know you're in first. As regards the intermediate gears, as long as it feels right, sounds right, then it is right.
So one issue I often see with new riders is they come up to a junction, come to a stop, and then they're on the wrong gear and stall. As you're approaching, second, first, press it again. You can press it as many times as you want down on that gear lever. That way you know you're in the correct gear. You should always be in first before you stop. Motorcycle gearboxes are not keen on changing gear stationary. First, 1 for luck, 2 for luck, doesn't matter. Get in that habit of keep pushing the gear selector down just before you come to a stop. So we can see the stop junction at the end of the road there. So we already know we've got to stop. So I'm going to come up into third gear. Now I've got a choice. I can either slow down and go second and then first before I stop, or because it's a stop junction, I can hold it in third Right, clutch in, second, first, 1, 2 for luck, and stop. So I appreciate if you're brand new, you may actually forget to change gear. That's okay, it comes with the territory, but it will improve with time. But just because you think you're in first doesn't mean you can't release the pressure on the gear selector and then try again and again, because it's much better to get those multiple changes done before you come to an actual stop. So it's like here, third, second, first, 1 for luck. Okay, so what happens then when I come to a junction and I'm in the wrong gear? So I'm in third, I come up to the junction to turn left, and I forget to change gear and I stop in third. Now if you don't realise, you're going to stall, that's the first thing. But if you do realise, very often you'll press the gear selector down and you can see that my gears aren't selecting at all. So I put my foot on top of the gear selector and I press gently, positively downwards, but I hold that pressure. I'm now going to allow the clutch to come out to the bite, and when it goes clonk and selects the gear, I'll bring the clutch immediately back to the handlebar. There we go. Right, I'm going to repeat that process for first. Right, it's done. I'm sorted. I sometimes see people kicking the life out of the gear selector. It's not gone into gear for a reason. It's to do with the alignment of all the components within the gearbox. Motorcycle gearboxes do not like changing gear when stationary. The other technique you can use rather than fiddling with the clutch is you can rock the bike gently, and that will achieve the same effect. But I find the clutch effect quite prompt, especially when you're in a live situation like that. Now if you're familiar with that technique, you won't get yourself in a panic, especially if you're on your bike test. The other good news is that bikes will very often pull away in second gear, and so if you stall because you've left it in second gear, it will very often indicate that you've not brought quite enough power on, or you may be a little bit too quick with the clutch. So I'm going to start this bike in second gear. And you can see there that it pulls away without any fuss at all, because of the amount of revs that I used, which wasn't excessive, and because of the care that I took with the clutch, and I can feel what's going on, the bike pulled away beautifully. So a lot of stalls that we see, particularly on test and in training, are because we haven't got into first from second. It doesn't have to be the end of the world. You've just got to be mindful and be aware in the way that you control your machine. As the old saying goes, always be in the correct position, in the correct speed, in the correct gear at the correct time. Said that before. Easy to say, harder to achieve. But gear is a really important part of your riding. And if you use the advanced system to ride rather than OSM PSL, which is the generally accepted learner way to ride, you can see that you have gear mentioned as part of the system. Information, always running, road position, speed, gear, acceleration. Information, position, speed, gear, acceleration. So when we look at this right hand bend, taking information, position, speed, gear, acceleration. And we'll use that system to deal with the junction in a moment as well. So position, speed, gear, which is already correct as it goes. We didn't know it would be. If I'd had to stop, it would have been a first. And then acceleration to leave the hazard safely. I think that's why the advanced system is really useful. Of course, you can change gear in the speed phase, because if your speed has dropped dramatically, you need a different gears. Now, when I was taught to used the system. There was quite a strong discipline behind it. Initially in your training, you were not allowed to combine braking and gear changing, or gear changing and cornering. So for example, if I'm going to turn left here, position, speed, so I'm going to get all my speed off, then make the gear change, then complete the turn. Now as you became more experienced and trained to a higher degree, you were allowed to overlap gear changing and braking, and in some cases you may be allowed to overlap turning and gear changing, and in some exceptional circumstances you may even overlap braking, turning and gear changing simultaneously. But you were not allowed to do it from the word go, because they wanted to get the discipline sorted out. So it's a great way of regulating your entry speed into a hazard, because your speed's got to be correct for you to make gear change. So, position, speed, gear, acceleration. So that really regulates that entry speed, because if that speed's not down sufficiently, you're not going to be able to make the turn properly and have time to complete the appropriate gear change. The difference would be, of course, if you had a car behind you coming up quite quickly, you felt a little bit threatened and intimidated by him. There's no problem with braking and gear changing at the same time at all, really, because you want to get that manoeuvre done and you want to get out the way before there's a possible conflict with that road user behind you. So we often talk about a flexible gear. What do I mean by a flexible gear? Well, what I mean is the bike should neither be over revving unnecessarily, and neither should the engine be labouring. So at the moment in this 30 limit, I'm in third gear and my revs are about just over 2,000. So if I go up to fourth, we've dropped to just under 2,000 revs, nearer 1,500. Now if I open the throttle, the bike does respond because it's got a lot of power, but it's not very responsive, and it shook a little bit there because it's a twin. Let's go down to a third. Now if I accelerate, the bike will take off a lot more quickly. Let's go down to a second. So the revs have now come up, we can hear the engine bubbling away a little bit more. Now imagine someone was to start to pull out in front of me and I didn't have time to brake. The bike's off. So when we talk about responsive gears and flexible gears, we should always be able to accelerate or slow purely based on a throttle response. Now when there are low hazards and you're thinking about vehicle sympathy and economy, by all means choose a higher gear just to potter along, keep the revs relatively low, the bike's nice and comfortable, you've got maximum economy and vehicle sympathy. It's like I might be planning an overtake. This gear is no good for an overtake. And similarly, if there was a junction ahead and I thought something might go wrong, this gear isn't any good either. So what I would do is I would change from the gear that I'm in now to a more responsive and flexible gear. Now if I don't want to change my road speed, I can do a matched rev gear change. So I keep the throttle open to a degree, pull the clutch in, shift lower, and then gently blend that lower gear. Now I can roll off the throttle. That gives me a little bit more engine braking, and if I wish to accelerate in a moment, I've got the choice to bring the power on immediately, start looking for that overtake. So I am in the correct gear for a rapid getaway, and as it happens I can't use it, and there is a junction here on the left, so I couldn't overtake anyway once we get around this bend. But I might want to overtake the vehicle off of the bend, so I'm going to leave the bike in a flexible gear. Now this bend might tighten up, so I may consider a second. There we go. So we've matched down to a second. I can feel I've got a lot more power and response on that engine, which means the overtake is there instantly. And now I've just relaxed it up into fourth, which is a lovely cruising gear. I'm only at 50 mile an hour national speed limit. I could go up into that fifth. Now we've got a saying, brakes are for slowing, gears are for going. That means that you should not use your gears to slow the motorcycle down. And by that what I mean is, so I'm going to slow down in a minute, so I close the throttle. I don't know if you heard the engine there, the revs came up. That is slowing down on the gears. That is not correct. What we should do is slow down by use of deceleration, and then as the road speed drops, we can then choose a lower gear if we so choose. And if we slow down in that lower gear, we will slow down further. That is probably where the term slowing down on the gears comes from. And back in my day you were told to slow down on the gears if you are on a slippery road. And that's quite correct. If you don't want to use your brakes, you should use engine braking to slow your machine down. However, it's often misinterpreted. So just to clarify, when we use the gears to slow down, we are using engine braking within the gear that we're in. As the speed drops, we then change to a lower gear, and if we then choose to decelerate on the throttle using engine braking within that gear, which is fine, and the bike will get slower and slower. What we don't do is change down to a lower gear while the road speed is high with the throttle closed and then let the clutch out. And there's a safety implication behind that, because if the gear that you choose is too low for your road speed, when you let the clutch out, you will lock the back wheel. Now I know a lot of modern motorcycles have slipper clutches and traction controls, and they may to a degree assist in preventing that problem from happening. But the vast majority of motorcycles, and especially the older motorcycles, the wheel will just lock and then the back will come out and you'll have a loss of control. And the only way to stop it is to pull the clutch in, reselect a different gear and then try again. And that requires a little bit of presence of mind to do that. So you can see, if the whole idea of using the gears to slow down on slippery road conditions was to prevent the brakes from causing you to slide, done carelessly, it will create exactly the problem we were trying to prevent in the first place. So it's about engine braking, not actually using the gears to slow down. So at the roundabout, I'm going to follow the road ahead. I'm in third gear. I know if I stop it's first. I know if it's a rolling start it'll be second. So I'm not going to change gear until I decide. Second, first. One for luck. First, second. So it's the same with the next roundabout here. It's going to be a first if I stop, it's going to be a second if I keep rolling, unless I'm very slow, and then it'll be a first. So it is a first. I'll change gear on the straight. So when we do change gear, in an ideal world, change gear while straight and upright, not whilst cornering. Sometimes it is unavoidable, but endeavour not to do so. So let's look at using the gears a little bit more now. So for rapid acceleration, I'm going to hang on to them a bit longer. So as I say, this bike's got quite a lot of power. It's 110 horsepower with plenty of torque. For that initial takeoff, we just hang on to it a little bit longer before we change gear, and we use the acceleration that the bike can deliver us. It's really useful, but we're not taking it up to the red line. That's not necessary. And then of course at these sort of speeds we're up into that top gear, which is 6th on this bike, it's 5th on some. And so we've got a nice balance now of a cruising gear, economy, vehicle sympathy. So I intend to leave the dual carriageway in a moment, and this is where I will do a block change. Because because I know that I've got to turn left ahead. Is I'm just going to slow down, put the brakes on. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, use the second, round the bend we go. So that is what we call block changing, and as part of a planned ride there's nothing wrong with it. And so I could now reduce my speed on the brakes, have a fourth, use it, have a third, use it, second, use it to turn. So previously on that junction we used the block change routine, and on that occasion we used the sequential change routine. So when we're on country roads and we want to make a bit of good progress, these lower gears are very usable and very workable. We don't want to be in too high a gear because we want to have that control on the throttle to be able to ride the bike, keep it under good control, both for acceleration and deceleration. So as the road opens up we can accelerate, and as the view gets worse we can just roll off and decelerate. So we can see the road sign there telling us we've got a really tight bend here. One vehicle behind, so I'm going to have a second gear for this one. Be careful of gravel on these country roads. So that second gear is great for working through here. We'll be up into a third in a moment. Like here I might choose to have a second matched rev gear change just for flexibility. Have a second here as well, match revs. So we've got a nice lot of control on the bike, purely on the throttle, not needing to go anywhere near the brakes. Rolling off the throttle for the tight left hander, still in second, so I'm in the correct gear as the view starts to open up. So we can come on to power, and then we're into a 30 limit, so we just adjust accordingly. And then we can just relax that engine in the 30 limit in third gear. It's still responsive, it's still flexible. There's a little bit more vehicle sympathy, a little bit more economy. Now in a moment we're going to turn right. So even if you're using OSM PSL, you know, rear obs, signal, position, speed, just don't forget to regulate your gears. I'm going to go for a first straight away with a block change here. And hopefully you can just hear that engine. You can hear how I'm going to use those gears. So at the moment I'm still holding mine in second for this road. See, I've got the hill. So with hills, if you're going to go down a hill, select a lower gear earlier because you haven't got to use the brakes so much then. You can use a little bit of brake here. First time I've used it for this hill, off the brake for the bend. I've got all that engine braking. It's really helpful. Similarly, if you're going to go up a hill, you may wish to choose a lower gear so you can get up the hill without the bike struggling. Anticipation's good, you know, get that gear in early so it's ready for the job that you need it to do. Anticipation's everything on the road, isn't it? Especially with a motorcycle. So it's like with these gears. Now if I was going to think about overtaking, I'll have a second in anticipation. It's rolling off the throttle there, and because of the gear it sets me up nicely for the bend. If I was in too high a gear I could have carried too much speed and then had to use the brakes quite heftily, which I didn't want to do. So you can see how the gears are really useful. If that gear's correct for the job in hand, you can really ride the bike. And just use the brakes so much less. Okay, so that's the end of this video on gears. Thank you for watching. I hope it's given you some interesting things to think about, and I hope it helps you develop with your training and your use of the gears on your motorcycle. Keep the practice up and remember the importance of your gears. So until next time, ride safe, take care, see you again.